and welcome to Sectors Up Close. I'm Angeline Ong. Our focus today is on the healthcare sector, and our guest is Howie Li, head of ETFs at LGIM. Now, the central story supporting investment in healthcare is an aging population in the developed world. Baby boomers started retiring 10 years ago, making healthcare a key commodity. But the pandemic has disrupted the sector. People avoided doctors and hospitals, while governments spent billions on vaccines and coronavirus treatments. Overall, the sector, as measured by the MSCI World Healthcare Index, slightly underperformed the wider market both last year and this, up around 7% so far this year. And as you can see, this index is dominated by big global drug makers, but also includes healthcare providers and medical equipment makers. So now that vaccinations are being rolled out and we see a recovery in elective and other treatments, what's the outlook for this sector and what are the ways to invest in it? Let's ask LGIM's Howie Li. Hey Howie, thank you so much for joining us. Before we get to your own healthcare ETF, I wanted to ask you for your outlook on the sector, given, as I mentioned, the progress made in vaccinations.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. The progress being made is, of course, extremely promising when it comes to the vaccine. But we should always keep in mind that actually what we're really targeting in terms of healthcare is prevention in the future, the ability to diagnose much earlier on to make sure that actually when it comes to medicine, we're not just treating illnesses when patients get them, but actually trying to prevent that. And that's a multi-year thing that's really the industry needs to focus on. And I think what's really interesting about the space, it's the convergence of life sciences, artificial intelligence, and robotics.
Now, which subsectors do you think are better positioned this year and why? What about big pharma?
Yeah, a great question. So if you look at 2020, for example, telehealth was an area that really dominated and has done extremely well. And actually year to date, perhaps a little bit less so. But it's always very important for investors to remember to have a balance in the portfolio when you're targeting healthcare innovations and healthcare breakthroughs. There are many different areas to focus on. For us, we cover 9, included in some of them for this year, which are certainly the best performance so far, are things like process automation for companies such as Brooks Automation or medical instruments. Think about companies which are 3D printing implants for organ and bone transplants, or Star Surgical, another company which are essentially designing and manufacturing implantable lenses for the eye. And so I think the robotics, medical instrument, and process automation will continue to do well into this year.
I've been looking at your fund, and it's interesting that along with medical instruments and process automation, you also have diagnostics as one of the top sectors. Talk us through your top 10 constituents. I mean, what is the thinking behind Nuance and Charles River, for example?
Yep. So I think first and foremost, when it comes to top 10, you'll probably notice that our portfolio tends not to be completely overweighted to any single name. We like to take a very broad approach to our index. We certainly give certain weights, a little bit stronger for their leadership positions. But if you take a look at, some of those companies, I think, I'll use Intuitive Surgical as one of them. They are the leaders in robotic surgery. You're able to do surgery essentially remotely from one hospital on a patient in a completely other location. That kind of stuff is very transformative. If you start thinking about where we are right now, and there's all these COVID concerns still about social distancing, et cetera, a lot of these processes via robotics, via automation, these are really important breakthroughs for us in today's world, but certainly as we kind of look forward to the next 10 years.
Now, this ETF, like many growth funds, had a good 2020 and then a pullback this year. Is now a time to be investing in these sectors given the market's rotation to value?
Yeah, it's a great observation. So in terms of valuations, it's certainly looking more attractive now than, let's say, a few months ago. If you look at the performance of the portfolio that we manage, over the last 12 months, it's still performed over 50%. Now, year to date, there has indeed been some pullback, but you can see that across the entire equities market. And this portfolio actually performs quite differently from some of the large cap portfolios you mentioned with the big name pharmaceutical companies, with the big name healthcare companies. We always encourage investors to take a look at our portfolio to then realize that actually there are some really unique positions and stocks in here which are designed to be diversified so that investors can really focus on that long-term return that can actually come from breakthroughs in healthcare.
Right, thank you very much. We have to leave it there. That was Howie Li, the head of ETFs at LGIM. Now, before I go, here are some of the top stories in the healthcare sector. Bayer says it will review the future of its Roundup and other weed killers in the US residential market after a judge rejected a $2 billion plan to settle future claims alleging it causes cancer. The judge called the plan, quote, clearly unreasonable. It would have provided compensation for 30,000 ongoing claims in return for placing limits on lawsuits. France's Sanofi and Britain's GlaxoSmithKline kicked off their phase 3 trials of its COVID-19 vaccine with the aim of getting it approved by the end of this year. The study is one of the first late-stage trials that combines tests for boosters and variants as drug makers deal with an evolving coronavirus. And finally, medical device maker Medtronic had reported a doubling of profit in its fourth quarter, helped by a recovery in its core business as more people opted for non-urgent procedures. Medical device makers have been expecting a boost in deferred procedures to treat a backlog of patients who held off treatment during the pandemic. Revenue in the 3 months to April 30th rose 37% to around $8.2 billion. And that's your roundup of the healthcare sector. I'm Angeline Ong, and this is Reuters.